The streets of Aurora, Colorado were quiet that August evening, the kind of silence that seems normal until something shatters it. Elijah McClain, a 23-year-old massage therapist and violinist, moved through the neighborhood at a measured pace. He was a man known for his gentleness, a soft-spoken presence whose quiet nature endeared him to everyone who knew him. Tonight, like most nights, he wore a ski mask to protect himself from the chill, a precaution due to his anemia. Inside his backpack rested his violin, a constant companion that had soothed him through childhood hardships. Elijah hummed softly, the faint notes of a classical tune blending with the hum of streetlights. It was a simple walk home from a convenience store, a short route he had taken countless times before. Yet this night would unfold in ways he could never have imagined. Somewhere, a neighbor dialed 911. Their words painted a picture of fear and suspicion, a young man, masked, acting strangely, waving his arms. It was a perception built on misunderstanding. They didn't know Elijah. They didn't see his calm movements, his peaceful intent. But soon, the perception would matter more than reality. Minutes later, the familiar thrum of police radios cut through the night. Officers arrived, lights flashing, their presence urgent and imposing. Elijah, noticing the sudden attention, stopped in his tracks. He raised his hands in a gesture of non-aggression. "I'm just walking home," he said, his voice calm, even soft. "I don't want any trouble." The officers approached, their eyes fixed on him with caution, their hands instinctively reaching for tools of restraint. Elijah, ever polite, maintained a safe distance. He spoke slowly, clearly, trying to diffuse the tension. But in those moments, misunderstanding and fear collided. "Hands up, don't move," one officer commanded. Elijah obeyed, raising both hands above his head. His movements were deliberate, careful, meant to communicate peace. Yet the officers misinterpreted his posture, seeing hesitation where there was none, interpreting movement for aggression. Suddenly, the situation escalated. The officers closed in, physical force replacing verbal negotiation. Elijah's arms flailed briefly, more out of instinct than resistance. Within seconds, he was restrained on the ground. The struggle was brief, but intense enough to be traumatic. Passers-by stopped, some recording on their phones, their faces etched with confusion and fear. Paramedics arrived at the scene shortly after. Their presence, meant to stabilize, instead introduced a dangerous variable: ketamine, a sedative used to control violent or agitated individuals. Elijah, calm and compliant, posed no threat. Yet the paramedics, following protocol for perceived aggression, administered a dose far beyond what would be considered safe for a person of his size and condition. Elijah cried out in alarm as the drug entered his system. His body began to weaken, his movements slowing, his voice struggling to form coherent words. Fear mingled with confusion as he gasped for air, fighting against both the physical restraint and the sedative that was meant to calm him. The paramedics' intentions were clinical, procedural, but the consequences were deadly. Witnesses in the neighborhood watched helplessly. Some shouted at the officers to stop. Others recorded every moment on their phones. The video footage, later leaked, would show a young man who was terrified, compliant, and confused, someone who never posed a real threat. Yet, in that moment, the narrative on the street was chaos. Lights flashed, voices shouted, and Elijah's life hung precariously in the balance. As the ambulance doors closed behind him, the scene outside began to settle into an eerie silence. Officers stood, radioing in updates, faces tight with professional detachment. Neighbors whispered to each other, the words a mix of shock and disbelief. "Why did they have to sedate him?" one asked. Another murmured, "He wasn't doing anything wrong." Inside the ambulance, Elijah's condition deteriorated rapidly. The ketamine, combined with physical restraint, suppressed his breathing. Medical monitors beeped, but the signs of distress were subtle at first, easily overlooked by professionals trained to respond to aggression, not innocence. Elijah's hands twitched weakly. His eyes blinked, searching the sterile interior of the vehicle for understanding, for reassurance. No one explained, no one comforted. Minutes stretched into an eternity as paramedics worked to stabilize him. each passing second was critical. His heart rate faltered, oxygen levels dropped, and the young man who had walked calmly through the streets only moments ago now teetered on the edge between life and death. The gentle musical soul who had hummed his favorite tune was now silenced, his body fighting an invisible force with every shallow breath. Meanwhile, the narrative outside began to take shape. Reports would later describe Elijah as resisting arrest, suspicious, and aggressive. But the truth was starkly different. The eyewitnesses, the video recordings, and even the body cam footage would all testify to a man who never once struck anyone, never threatened violence, never deserved the fate he was about to meet. As the ambulance drove away, sirens wailing into the night, Elijah McClain faded into unconsciousness. The neighborhood, once quiet and familiar, felt suddenly alien. Lights from nearby homes flickered on, neighbors peering from windows, hearts pounding with unease. A simple walk home had spiraled into tragedy. By the time the ambulance arrived at the hospital, it was too late. Elijah's heart had stopped. Attempts to revive him would fail. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors, a young life had ended. Not in a battle, not in crime, but as a result of misunderstanding, systemic negligence, and misjudged authority. The news of Elijah McClain's death spread like wildfire through Aurora and beyond. Friends, family, and neighbors were stunned. Elijah, a young man whose life had been defined by kindness, music, and generosity, was gone. No crime had been committed by him, yet his death was treated with the cold precision of a statistic. Inside the hospital, the official narrative began to form. Authorities described Elijah's death as suspicious, a phrase that seemed deliberately vague. The medical examiner's report noted complications from ketamine, physical restraint, and underlying conditions, but it offered little explanation for why a young, unarmed, and compliant man had been sedated at all. To the public, these words sounded like bureaucratic jargon, a veil hiding something darker. Elijah's parents, Monique and Leon McClain, were devastated. The grief was immediate, raw, and overwhelming. Monique replaying the last memory of her son walking home, imagining his soft hum, the way he had always tried to brighten the lives around him. He was such a gentle soul, she would tell anyone who asked, tears streaming down her face. He wouldn't hurt a fly. How could this happen to him? Meanwhile, the neighborhood was alive with whispers, speculation, and growing anger. Witnesses who had seen the restraint and the sedative administration began to speak out. Their accounts clashed violently with the official reports. "He wasn't resisting. He wasn't violent," said one neighbor. "He was scared, that's all. He was scared and trying to explain himself." Another witness uploaded a short video to social media, a shaky, brief clip showing Elijah being pinned to the ground, hands raised, eyes wide with terror. The video went viral, igniting a conversation that no authority could contain. Investigators began piecing together the timeline of events, examining 911 calls, body cam footage, and medical reports. The footage revealed subtle but chilling details. Officers closing in before Elijah could even respond, hands gripping arms with unnecessary force, a young man struggling to breathe while trying to explain he was unarmed. The ketamine, intended to subdue aggression, flowed into his body without medical justification. Experts in law enforcement and medicine weighed in publicly. Many condemned the use of ketamine in this situation, describing it as dangerous, excessive, and entirely avoidable. Some pointed out that a man of Elijah's weight, roughly 140 pounds, received a dose intended for someone much larger and potentially combative. Respiratory failure was a foreseeable risk, yet it happened anyway. Social media erupted. Hashtags calling for justice for Elijah trended nationally. Activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens shared the video, demanding transparency and accountability. Memes, posts, and news articles turned a local tragedy into a national conversation. The story was no longer just about one young man, it was about systemic issues in policing, the misuse of medical authority, and the undervaluing of Black lives. Public pressure forced authorities to respond. Statements were issued, internal reviews, pending investigations, and promises of transparency. But for Elijah's family and the growing community of supporters, these words felt hollow. Each press release, each carefully worded sentence was a reminder that the system they trusted to protect them might be complicit in hiding the truth. As Part 2 unfolded, the tension between public perception and official narrative intensified. Citizens organized peaceful protests, candlelight vigils, and online petitions. They demanded the release of all body cam footage, medical reports, and incident logs. Each delay, each vague answer, only fueled anger. Local media amplified the conflict, interviewing neighbors and friends who spoke of Elijah's music, his kindness, and the tragedy of a life cut short for no reason. Meanwhile, inside government offices and police headquarters, the investigation proceeded behind closed doors. Officers involved in the incident were placed on administrative leave, a procedural move that did little to reassure the public. The paramedics who administered the ketamine were also questioned, but their testimony was framed within professional jargon, downplaying the severity of the situation. Elijah's parents, however, refused to be silenced. They met with lawyers, advocates, and civil rights organizations. Every detail mattered: the dosage of ketamine, the manner of restraint, the timeline of events, and the communication between police and paramedics. They meticulously gathered evidence, seeking patterns of negligence or misconduct. The community rallied behind them. Fundraisers, marches, and social media campaigns kept Elijah's story alive in the public eye. Artists painted murals, musicians dedicated performances, and writers chronicled his life. Elijah's violin, once a personal companion, became a symbol of a life silenced. The gentle melody he played now resonated as a haunting reminder of injustice. Despite the growing public pressure, answers were slow to arrive. Official reports were delayed, investigations stretched on, and every release of information seemed carefully curated to minimize accountability. The narrative spun by authorities often contradicted what witnesses described, leaving the public skeptical and frustrated. Experts began analyzing the broader implications. The combination of restraint and ketamine, they noted, was particularly dangerous in situations without actual aggression. Cases like Elijah's highlighted systemic failures in police training, medical oversight, and judgment under pressure. The story became less about one man and more about structural flaws that allowed such tragedies to occur. By the time Part 3 begins, Elijah McClain's story had spread far beyond Aurora. Social media amplified his death to a national stage. Every video clip, every eyewitness account, and every fragment of body cam footage became evidence, not just of a single tragedy, but of a larger systemic problem. The hashtag Justice for Elijah trended across the country. Ordinary citizens, activists, and journalists alike voiced disbelief, sorrow, and rage. Monique and Leon McClain, Elijah's parents, had become unwilling but powerful symbols in a growing movement for accountability. Their grief was profound and raw, yet they channeled it into action. With each day that passed, they attended more meetings, spoke at more rallies, and gave interviews to news outlets, always emphasizing the truth about their son. He was gentle, kind, and unarmed. He did not deserve this, Monique told a crowd of hundreds at a candlelight vigil. He was just walking home. The streets of Aurora began to fill. Protesters marched with candles, signs, and placards, demanding transparency from the police and justice for Elijah. Murals depicting his face, violin, and gentle smile appeared overnight, each one a poignant reminder of the life cut short. Families, community leaders, and activists spoke in unison, condemning what they described as the misuse of power, systemic negligence, and a culture that allowed such tragedies to occur. Inside government offices, the tension was palpable. Police leaders defended the officers, claiming protocols had been followed. Paramedics argued that ketamine was administered to control what they believed was a potentially dangerous situation. Each press briefing, however, only fueled public skepticism.
Contradictions between witness statements, video evidence, and official reports emerged repeatedly. The perception that justice was being delayed or obstructed intensified. Meanwhile, lawyers representing the McClains and civil rights organizations began building a legal case. Every detail mattered: the 911 call that labeled Elijah as suspicious, the officer's initial interactions, the manner of physical restraint, and the paramedics' administration of ketamine. Legal experts weighed in publicly, highlighting how this combination of restraint and sedative could easily result in death, especially in someone with Elijah's medical conditions. The narrative in the media shifted rapidly. News outlets reported not just the facts of the night Elijah died, but also the broader implications. Editorials questioned law enforcement protocols, systemic bias, and the repeated failures in handling situations involving unarmed black men. Elijah's story became emblematic of national conversations about race, policing, and accountability, transforming personal tragedy into a rallying cry for justice. Tension escalated as protests became more visible and impassioned. Police presence at demonstrations increased, creating a tense and sometimes confrontational atmosphere. Helicopters hovered above, drones captured footage, and local news stations broadcast the events live. Chants of "Justice for Elijah" and "No more silence" echoed through the streets, carrying both grief and defiance. At the same time, the officers involved were shielded by procedural delays. Administrative leaves, internal reviews, and bureaucratic jargon slowed the legal process, leaving the public frustrated. Every delay reinforced a perception of a system more invested in protecting its own than in protecting truth or human life. This contrast between the immediacy of grief and protest on the streets and the sluggish pace of institutional accountability heightened the story's tension. Experts began analyzing the situation publicly. Law enforcement professionals, medical experts, and civil rights attorneys debated the appropriate use of ketamine and restraint. The consensus among independent specialists was damning. The actions that night were unnecessary and dangerous. Elijah's calm demeanor should have been enough to de-escalate the situation, yet he had been treated as a threat, sedated, restrained, and left to die. The McClains, exhausted yet relentless, worked tirelessly with legal counsel to bring these findings into the spotlight. They met with journalists, appeared in interviews, and documented every detail they could gather. Their pain was palpable, yet it was channeled into purpose. Monique often held vigil with other mothers, comforting them while sharing her own loss, turning grief into activism. Social media continued to play a critical role. Viral posts, tweets, and videos kept Elijah's story alive in the public consciousness. Celebrities, politicians, and public figures weighed in, demanding accountability and policy reforms. Each new voice amplified the outrage, turning local tragedy into a nationwide issue. Online, hashtags like "Justice for Elijah" and "End Police Brutality" became more than mere trends. They were calls to action. The emotional core of Part 3 is the community's fury paired with hope. Vigils and protests were somber yet empowering, a visual testament to how one young man's life inspired a movement. Murals, candlelight gatherings, and marches humanized Elijah, ensuring the public never saw him as just another statistic. Meanwhile, the slow-moving legal system continued to frustrate and anger those seeking justice. As Part 3 nears its climax, tension reaches a boiling point. Demonstrations swell to hundreds, then thousands, with chants echoing across city blocks. News footage shows the crowd holding vigil at the site of Elijah's death, tears and anger mixing in the faces of young and old alike. Each moment emphasizes that the story is no longer about one night. It is about systemic injustice, about lives affected by decisions that should never have been made. Yet in the midst of public pressure, the legal system remains uncertain. Investigations proceed slowly. Officials insist on due process, while families and activists see delays as obstruction. The emotional stakes are high. Every day without accountability feels like a betrayal. Every headline reminding the world that Elijah's life was ended by negligence deepens the audience's engagement.
Months had passed since that fateful night in Aurora. Elijah McClain's death had rippled far beyond the quiet streets he once walked, reaching the hearts and minds of people across the nation. Yet for those closest to him, his parents, friends, and the community, the pain was raw and persistent. Grief was not a passing storm. It was a landscape that had reshaped their lives entirely. Monique and Leon McClain continued to carry their son's memory with solemn reverence, but they had transformed sorrow into purpose. Every interview they gave, every rally they attended, and every meeting with lawmakers was motivated by one goal: ensuring Elijah's story could no longer be ignored. His life, they insisted, mattered, and his death must catalyze change. The movement that had begun in Aurora had now become a national conversation.
The hashtags, posts, and viral videos that circulated after his death were more than digital signals. They were rallying cries. Vigils were held in cities hundreds of miles away, candlelight gatherings paying homage to a young man who had never harmed anyone, yet whose life had been taken under circumstances that shocked the nation. Artists painted murals of Elijah, often depicting him holding his violin, a serene smile on his face, contrasting starkly with the chaos that had taken him from the world. Musicians composed songs in his memory, blending sorrow and hope, while poets and writers chronicled his life and death. These works captured the attention of people who had never set foot in Aurora, ensuring Elijah's legacy spread far beyond the local community. The legal battle, slow and painstaking, continued in the background. Investigations into the officers' and paramedics' actions were underway, but procedural delays and bureaucratic hurdles frustrated the McClains and the public alike. Each new filing, every request for transparency, became a small victory, though the ultimate justice they sought remained elusive. Experts, lawyers, and advocates dissected every report, every medical record, every video clip, emphasizing systemic failures that allowed the tragedy to occur. At the same time, activists began leveraging Elijah's story to push for tangible reforms. Policies around the use of sedatives in emergency situations were scrutinized. Questions about the protocols for physical restraint in encounters with non-threatening individuals became a central topic of legislative hearings. Police reform, once a distant debate, now included specific recommendations aimed at preventing future tragedies like Elijah's. Yet, amidst the activism and media attention, the human cost remained at the forefront. Monique often spoke of the private grief that no one could fully understand. She described the haunting quiet of her home with Elijah's laughter, the empty violin case in the corner, and the memories that refused to fade. Leon shared stories of his son's kindness, from helping neighbors carry groceries to tutoring younger children in music. These intimate recollections reminded the public that Elijah was more than a viral story. He was a real person, a life that deserved recognition and justice. The McClains also worked tirelessly to ensure that Elijah's narrative was not co-opted or misrepresented. Social media campaigns emphasized his humanity, combating narratives that sought to paint him as a threat or suspicious. Every post, video, and article they supported was a reminder. Elijah had lived, had dreams, and had potential that was stolen that night in August. As national attention grew, so did pressure on local authorities. Public opinion, amplified by viral campaigns and media coverage, forced a reconsideration of the cases against the officers and paramedics involved. Investigations that had stalled began to accelerate, and discussions about accountability became unavoidable. The world was watching, and Aurora could no longer hide behind procedural delays or bureaucratic jargon. Community leaders also highlighted the broader systemic issues Elijah's case exposed. Instances of excessive force, misapplied medical interventions, and racial bias in law enforcement were no longer abstract discussions. They were grounded in the very real story of a young black man who had been walking home humming a tune when the system failed him. Educational forums, panel discussions, and public hearings drew attention to these injustices, using Elijah's story as a case study for reform. Despite all the activism and awareness, there was still a profound sense of absence. Elijah's family, friends, and community members lived every day with the void left by his passing. But in that absence, his legacy began to crystallize. It was not just a tale of tragedy, it was a rallying cry, a movement demanding a better, more just society. Elijah's violin became an emblem of resilience. During vigils, children and musicians would play melodies in his honor, transforming sorrow into a form of communal healing. His story was told to strangers and students alike, teaching lessons about compassion, vigilance, and the value of human life. By the end of Part 4, the narrative shifts to reflection and hope. Elijah McClain's death had revealed the fragility of life in the face of systemic failures, but it also illuminated the power of collective action. His family's perseverance, the community's support, and the growing national awareness underscored one fundamental truth. Even in death, Elijah's voice, gentle, musical, and filled with humanity, resonated loudly. The story closes with a poignant image. Monique and Leon standing before a mural of their son, candles flickering in the evening breeze, surrounded by friends, neighbors, and supporters who have taken up Elijah's cause. A soft violin melody plays in the background, a reminder of the life that once was, the loss that was endured, and the movement that continues. In the final moments, the audience is left with a mixture of heartbreak and hope. Elijah McClain's life was unjustly cut short, but his memory has become a force that refuses to be silenced. His story challenges viewers to confront uncomfortable truths about power, authority, and justice, and it inspires them to demand accountability, reform, and compassion in a world that so often forgets the humanity of those it affects most. Closing thought. Tragedy became a movement. Silence became a call for justice. And the gentle soul who once walked peacefully through Aurora now walks in the hearts and minds of people demanding change, his legacy alive, enduring, and transformative.